The crystal tumbler caught amber light from the fireplace, casting fractured patterns across Dante Cale's knuckles as he lifted it to his lips. The private room of the Obsidian Room overlooked Chicago's glittering skyline through floor-to-ceiling windows that transformed the city into a jewelry box of possibility and threat. He'd chosen this particular leather armchair for its strategic positioning back, pressed against the solid mahogany wall lined with first editions, clear sightlines to both entrances, proximity to the service corridor that promised escape routes he'd never needed, but always maintained. The cigar bar hummed with the particular frequency of power, low conversations between men who moved markets with phone calls, the soft clink of expensive glassware against polished tables, the rustle of newspapers worth more for what they didn't print than what they did. A violinist in the corner played something melancholy that mingled with the scent of aged tobacco and Italian leather, the kind of establishment where memberships passed through generations like heirlooms and questions about one's business were considered unforgivably vulgar. Dante had carved his empire from the South Side's forgotten streets, building legitimacy on foundations most people preferred not to examine too closely. At 39, he commanded respect through a careful balance of calculated generosity and whispered rumors about what happened to those who mistook his philanthropy for weakness. The gray threading through his dark hair at the temples only enhanced his authority, a visual reminder that he'd survived long enough to accumulate both wisdom and scars that didn't show on the surface. Tonight was supposed to be about solitude, a rare evening without the constant demands of territory management, without associates seeking approval for decisions they should make themselves, without the performative networking that accompanied maintaining his dual existence as both legitimate businessman and something considerably less legal. He'd brought Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov, more prop than genuine reading material, but the weight of it on the side table felt appropriate somehow. Russians understood the complexity of morality better than most Americans ever would. The door to the private room opened without the customary knock that preceded server entries. Dante's attention shifted incrementally, not sudden enough to appear startled, but with the predatory focus of someone whose survival had always depended on noticing details others missed. His fingers didn't move toward the weapon concealed beneath his jacket, but they remembered its position with muscle memory built over 2 decades. She entered like smoke, finding its way through a sealed room, a woman in her late 20s wearing a charcoal dress that suggested corporate efficiency except for the way she moved, which spoke of someone accustomed to navigating dangerous spaces where a wrong step meant consequences far worse than embarrassment. Her auburn hair was pulled back severely, revealing a face that combined striking bone structure with the kind of exhaustion that came from sustained fear rather than simple fatigue. Dark circles beneath her eyes told stories her composed expression tried to contradict. The staff wouldn't have let her through without reason. Dante knew every member of the Obsidian's security detail personally, had ensured their compensation and loyalty through methods both financial and otherwise. That she'd reached his private room meant either catastrophic security failure or deliberate allowance, and he didn't believe in coincidental failures. Later, he would learn that she'd shown credentials identifying herself as a corporate security consultant, with urgent information for a client, vague enough to be plausible, specific enough to bypass protocols designed to filter out exactly this kind of unexpected intrusion. She crossed the Persian rug with purpose, her heels making no sound against the antique fibers, despite their height, either expensive craftsmanship or practiced silence born from necessity. Her eyes swept the room in a pattern Dante recognized immediately, checking exits, identifying potential weapons, calculating distances and angles. Not civilian behavior, not even standard criminal behavior. Military training, perhaps. Intelligence background. Something that had taught her to read spaces the way predators read prey. Mr. Cale. Her voice carried the controlled steadiness of someone delivering information under extreme stress, each word precisely chosen and carefully released like valuable currency spent sparingly. I apologize for the intrusion. I wouldn't be here if there were any other option available to me. Dante set down his tumbler with deliberate calm, the gesture buying him seconds to assess what stood before him. She knew his name, not surprising given his profile in certain circles, but the way she used it suggested familiarity beyond public knowledge, beyond what newspapers printed or competitors whispered. Her hands remained visible at her sides, empty but trembling slightly despite obvious efforts at control. Fear radiated from her like heat, but not fear of him. Something worse. Something that had driven her to seek out a man whose reputation should have made her run in the opposite direction. You have 30 seconds to justify interrupting my evening before I have you removed. His voice carried no particular threat. Just statement of fact, delivered in the tone that made associates explain themselves with efficiency born from understanding consequences. I suggest you use them wisely. She glanced toward the windows, then away, a tell so obvious it had to be deliberate. Was she drawing his attention somewhere she didn't want it? Warning him about something outside? The violinist's melody shifted into something that sounded like rain falling on tombstones, melancholic and inevitable. A soundtrack for whatever confession was about to emerge. Don't look up. She took 3 steps closer, close enough now that he could see the pulse hammering visibly at her throat, the way her pupils were slightly dilated despite the room's warm lighting. They're targeting you. 3 buildings over, 15th floor, window facing this direction. Rifle setup, thermal scope. They've had position for 20 minutes. Maybe longer. The words landed with the precise weight of truth delivered by someone who knew exactly what they were describing. Dante's expression didn't change. Decades of practice had taught him that reactions revealed more than silence ever could. But his mind immediately began calculating angles and probabilities with the cold efficiency that had kept him alive through situations that should have killed him. The obsidian room sat on the 14th floor. 3 buildings over would be the Meridian Tower, mostly vacant offices after 6 p.m., the kind of commercial space that changed tenants frequently enough that unfamiliar faces wouldn't draw attention. 15th floor would provide downward angle through these very windows he'd admired for their view. Thermal scope negated whatever concealment the leather chair might have offered. If she was telling the truth, he'd been sitting in a kill box for 20 minutes while reading about Russian philosophy and drinking bourbon worth more than most people's monthly rent. And you know this because? His right hand remained steady as he reached casually for his phone, not to call for help, but to access building schematics his people maintained for every structure within a 3-block radius of locations he frequented. The preparation of paranoia proving its value yet again, justifying years of what others might have called excessive caution, because I was supposed to be part of it. She was trembling visibly now, the adrenaline dump of betrayal or fear finally overwhelming whatever training had taught her to maintain composure. I worked for the people who want you dead. I'm the one who scouted this location, confirmed your pattern of Thursday evenings here, and provided the sightlines and timing windows that made tonight possible. The admission hung in the air between them like cordite after gunfire, dense and impossible to ignore. The violinist continued playing, oblivious to the drama unfolding in the private room. Men at other tables laughed about something inconsequential, their worlds continuing uninterrupted while threat crystallized into specific, actionable danger mere feet away. Dante studied her with the intensity he brought to negotiations where millions changed hands or territories shifted ownership through violence or persuasion. The dress was expensive, but not current season, someone maintaining appearances on a budget that had grown tighter recently. No jewelry except a thin scar on her ring finger where a wedding band had been removed, the skin still slightly paler than surrounding tissue. Her nails were professionally manicured but chipped at the edges, suggesting maintenance had become sporadic. The overall picture assembled itself. Competence fallen on harder circumstances, someone skilled enough to be valuable but desperate enough to be compromised by whoever had offered solutions to problems she couldn't solve alone. Why tell me? He set his phone face down on the armrest, a gesture of either trust or tactical misdirection that she could interpret however served her confession. If you helped set this up, you're complicit in attempted murder. Confessing doesn't absolve you, it just makes you a traitor to both sides with nowhere safe to land. Her laugh came out brittle, breaking on edges that revealed how close she was to complete emotional collapse. Because they're targeting you now, but I'm next. I was always next, I just didn't realize it until about an hour ago, when I saw the secondary team positioning near my apartment building. The people who hired me don't leave loose ends, Mr. Kale. They don't tolerate witnesses or former assets who know too much. I'm what you'd call a soon-to-be loose end, and I've seen what happens to people who become inconvenient. She moved to the chair opposite his uninvited, collapsing into it with the graceless exhaustion of someone whose nervous system had finally exceeded its capacity for sustained panic. The composed professional who'd entered moments ago had crumbled into something rawer, more human, and more desperate. You have maybe 10 minutes before they realize something's wrong with their timeline. I'm supposed to call when you're settled and stationary, when the shot is clear and the escape route is confirmed. When I don't make that call, they'll either take the shot anyway and hope for success, or abort and come looking for why their inside asset went silent. Neither option ends well for me. Dante processed the information with the speed that had kept him alive through 2 decades of navigating Chicago's underworld politics, where allegiances shifted like sand and yesterday's ally became tomorrow's corpse. She was either telling the truth, in which case immediate action was required to survive the next 10 minutes, or this was an elaborate setup designed to move him from one kill box into another, in which case immediate action was also required, just in a different direction. Who hired you? He stood in a single fluid motion, moving away from the window's sightline while appearing casual enough not to alarm other patrons enjoying their evening. Years of practice made the movement look natural, like he was simply stretching tired muscles or refreshing his drink at the private bar cart positioned strategically near the service door. Does it matter right now? She rose too, following his lead instinctively, putting furniture between herself and the windows with movements that confirmed her tactical training. You have enemies, Mr. Kale. Probably more than you realize, more than you can count on both hands. This particular group calls themselves Covenant. Corporate military contractors gone private and very, very illegal. Someone paid them a substantial sum to make you disappear quietly. No investigation, no retaliation, just a tragic accident or sudden health crisis that closes your file permanently. Covenant. He knew the name. Everyone in his world knew the name, whispered with the kind of respect reserved for apex predators who'd earned their reputation through consistent, ruthless effectiveness. They didn't take small contracts or waste resources on targets that didn't justify their premium fees. Their client list, what little was known of it, read like a directory of governments and corporations that needed problems solved with permanent solutions and zero traceability. The mathematics of the situation crystallized with brutal clarity. Someone wanted him dead badly enough to hire the absolute best, which meant his usual security measures were inadequate, his usual protocols potentially compromised, his usual advantages possibly neutralized by opponents who'd studied him as thoroughly as he studied his own targets. And this woman, this self-admitted inside asset who'd helped mark him for death, had just thrown herself into his protection by warning him. Either the bravest move he'd witnessed in years or the most spectacularly stupid. The line between the two was often razor-thin, drawn in blood more often than ink. He looked at her directly for the first time since she'd entered, really seeing her beyond the tactical assessment, the intelligence burning in her eyes, fighting desperately with the fear trying to drown it. The way she held herself like someone trained to disappear in crowds but forced into terrifying visibility by circumstances beyond her control. The particular brand of courage that came from having already lost everything worth losing and choosing to die standing up rather than on her knees. Dante Kyle had built his reputation on making split-second decisions that others would agonize over for hours before choosing wrong. Hesitation killed more men than bullets ever had. Analysis paralysis was a luxury for people who didn't live in his world, who didn't understand that survival often came down to trusting instincts honed over decades of dancing with death. He crossed to her in 3 deliberate strides, close enough now that she had to tilt her head back to meet his gaze. Close enough that his presence filled the space between them, not threatening exactly, but overwhelmingly certain, like gravity asserting itself over objects too small to resist. What's your name? Sienna Voss. He let the name settle into memory, filing it alongside the 1,000 other details his mind automatically cataloged about everyone who entered his orbit. Then he smiled, not the public smile he deployed for cameras and charity galas, but something quieter, more dangerous, the expression of a man who just accepted a challenge and found himself unexpectedly looking forward to whatever came next. Well, Sienna Voss, he said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, intimate enough that she leaned in instinctively to catch every word. Stay close to me. The service corridor behind the Obsidian's private rooms smelled like industrial cleaner, and the anxiety of workers who'd learned to become invisible when certain guests required discretion. Dante moved through it with the practiced ease of someone who'd memorized every exit in every building he frequented, a habit that seemed paranoid until nights like this proved its essential wisdom. Sienna kept pace at his shoulder with the fluid motion of someone trained in tactical movement, matching his speed without instruction. How long have you worked for Covenant? His question came casual, conversational even, as if they were discussing weather rather than assassination contracts while descending a narrow stairwell that echoed with their footsteps. 3 years. After the Army discharged me, they recruited through a veteran networking event, the kind that looks legitimate on the surface, helps former soldiers find private sector work. Her breathing was controlled despite their rapid pace, military fitness maintaining itself even years after civilian transition. I was intelligence analysis, pattern recognition, behavioral prediction, that sort of thing. Covenant wanted people who could read targets, identify vulnerabilities, and provide operational intelligence for field teams who did the actual wet work. Dante processed this information, adding it to his growing understanding of who Sienna Voss actually was beneath the fear and desperation. Not muscle, not trigger puller, the person who figured out where targets would be and when, which made her the architect of vulnerability even if she'd never personally fired a shot or watched the light leave someone's eyes. In many ways, that made her more dangerous than the operatives she'd supported and more valuable as an asset now that she'd switched sides. They emerged into a parking garage, 3 levels below street access, the kind of place where Chicago's winter cold settled into permanent residency regardless of season, where concrete absorbed chill and released it slowly like a reservoir of discomfort. His car waited exactly where his driver had positioned it 6 hours ago, a black Mercedes that looked expensive but not ostentatious, armored beneath civilian appearance, the perfect balance between protection and discretion that had served him well through situations requiring rapid departure. Get in. He unlocked it remotely, scanning the garage with automatic vigilance that never fully shut off. Empty except for the usual overnight parkers, their vehicles sitting silent and patient. But empty spaces made him more nervous than crowded ones. Too much room for ambush, too many angles he couldn't cover simultaneously, too many shadows where threats might lurk. Sienna slid into the passenger seat with military efficiency, immediately checking mirrors and sight lines with movements so ingrained they'd become unconscious. Where are we going? Away from here, toward answers. He started the engine, the purr of German engineering filling the space between them with mechanical reliability. You said someone paid Covenant to kill me. Who? I don't know. She twisted in her seat to watch their exit route, her body language revealing continued threat assessment even as she answered his questions. That's not how it works. Covenant compartmentalizes everything. Information flows up and down through carefully controlled channels. I get target information, behavioral patterns, and location data. The client relationship happens 3 levels above my clearance, handled by people whose names I don't know. My handler just told me the target was you, provided parameters for the operation, and expected timeline for completion. The Mercedes climbed the garage's spiral exit into Chicago's night, emerging onto streets that gleamed with recent rain, reflecting neon and streetlights in fractured patterns. Dante drove with the same calculated precision he brought to everything else, not fast enough to attract attention from police or observers, not slow enough to be vulnerable to followers, always maintaining options for evasive maneuvers should they become necessary. But you must have suspicions. He navigated toward the interstate, heading south initially because north was too obvious. East led to the lake's dead end, and west took them through territories where his protection was strongest, but where Covenant would anticipate that logic and prepare accordingly. 3 years analyzing targets gives you pattern recognition that doesn't shut off when you clock out. What's my pattern saying? Sienna was quiet for several blocks, watching the city slide past like she was memorizing it or saying goodbye to places she might never see again. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of someone sharing conclusions they'd reached reluctantly, truths they wished weren't true. The contract came through their corporate channel, not criminal. That distinction matters. It means legitimate money at the origin, probably laundered through several holding companies, but ultimately traceable to someone with significant resources and legal presence who can't afford direct association with assassination. The timeline was extended 3 months of surveillance and planning instead of the usual rapid deployment Covenant uses for criminal targets. They wanted you studied, understood completely, caught in a moment where death would look natural, where investigation would lead nowhere, and retaliation would have no clear direction. She paused, glancing at him with eyes that held professional respect alongside fear. That level of caution? That's not about eliminating a criminal competitor who plays by rules everyone in your world understands. That's about removing a political obstacle or business threat. Someone who has too much to lose if your death looks like murder. Someone who needs this to appear as tragic accident or sudden illness that closes the file without opening others. The implications settled over him like weight he hadn't anticipated carrying. He'd spent 20 years navigating the delicate balance between his legitimate enterprises and the shadow operations that funded them, assuming threats would always originate from that second-world rivals making moves on territory, federal investigations probing too close to truth, ambitious lieutenants deciding their moment had arrived. But if Sienna's analysis was correct, the danger had originated from the respectable face he showed to the public. His real estate developments, his charitable foundations, his political connections carefully cultivated over years of patient networking. Somewhere in that carefully constructed legitimacy, he'd threatened someone powerful enough to hire Covenant and patient enough to wait months for the perfect opportunity to present itself. You said they're targeting you next. He merged onto I-90, the highway opening up before them with the empty promise of escape velocity. Taillights of other vehicles, creating red ribbons stretching toward horizons he couldn't quite see. Why? What changed between useful asset and loose end? I asked too many questions. Her hands twisted together in her lap, betraying the fear her voice tried valiantly to suppress. About the client's identity, about why this contract was so different from our usual work, about the extended timeline and excessive caution that didn't match standard protocols. Covenant runs on need-to-know compartmentalization. When you need to know more than your pay grade allows, when you start asking questions that suggest you're thinking beyond your assigned role, you become a security risk that requires management. She exhaled slowly, the sound carrying years of exhaustion compressed into a single breath. I saw the surveillance photos of my apartment building this afternoon, taken from a car I recognized, same team that handles cleanup operations. I've seen them work before. They make people disappear so thoroughly that investigations don't even begin because there's nothing left to investigate. I had maybe 2 hours to decide whether to run and spend the rest of my short life hiding in shadows, or warn the target and hope he's powerful enough to protect you. Dante finished the thought, understanding crystallizing into something approaching admiration. She'd gambled absolutely everything on his reputation, betting her life that the man Covenant wanted dead was dangerous enough to fight back effectively and maybe, just maybe, keep her alive in the process. The mathematics of desperation written across her choice, calculated with the same analytical precision she'd once used to mark others for death. I have a daughter. Sienna's voice cracked on the admission, the first genuine emotion breaking through her tactical composure like water through a dam. Emma. She's 6 years old. Lives with my ex-husband in Minneapolis. We separated before I took the Covenant work, and the distance has only grown since. I haven't seen her in 8 months because Covenant's work requires mobility and secrecy, because attachments are vulnerabilities that can be exploited. Tears tracked down her face now, exhaustion and fear finally overwhelming control she'd maintained through sheer willpower. When I saw that cleanup team outside my apartment, my first thought wasn't about myself. It was, they'll trace me to Emma. They'll use her to find me. Or worse, they'll eliminate her to erase any connection I have to the world, any reason I might have to resurface or talk to authorities. Her hands covered her face as if she could hide from the horror of her own imagination. I warned you because if I'm dead anyway, at least I can die having done one decent thing. At least I can die knowing I tried to stop being the person who helps kill people for money. At least I can die knowing I maybe, possibly, created a chance that my daughter stays safe because Covenant's attention stays focused on me and whoever I'm with. The revelation recontextualized everything he'd assessed since she walked through that door. This wasn't just about her survival. Wasn't the simple self-preservation he'd initially assumed motivated her betrayal of Covenant. It was about keeping dangerous attention focused on herself, away from a 6-year-old girl in Minneapolis who didn't understand why mommy worked so far away and called so rarely and never came to visit anymore. A mother's love expressed through sacrifice, through drawing fire toward herself and away from what she loved most. Dante reached across the center console, his palm settling on her shoulder with surprising gentleness for someone whose reputation suggested only capacity for violence. Then we keep them looking at us. We make enough noise that a child in Minneapolis doesn't register as relevant, doesn't appear on any radar that matters. We give them bigger problems to solve than tracking down family members who know nothing useful. Sienna looked at him through tears, hope and skepticism warring across her face in equal measure. How? Covenant has resources beyond what you can imagine, networks spanning continents, political protection that reaches into governments. They've survived this long by being untouchable. Everyone's touchable. The dangerous smile returned to Dante's face, the expression of someone who'd built an empire by finding vulnerabilities others assumed didn't exist. They just haven't met someone with enough resources and enough motivation to do the touching. Lucky for you, Sienna Voss, you just partnered with someone who has both in abundance. The safe house? In Gary, Indiana revealed itself in increments as motion sensors triggered sequential lighting throughout the property. What appeared from outside as a modest working-class bungalow, the kind of place factory workers might have owned 50 years ago, before manufacturing fled for cheaper shores, transformed inside into something considerably more sophisticated, reinforced walls hidden behind unremarkable drywall, bulletproof glass disguised as standard double-pane windows, communication equipment that would rival small intelligence agencies. Dante moved through the space with the familiarity of someone who'd prepared for worst-case scenarios long before they materialized, checking security panels with practiced efficiency. Verifying perimeter sensors showed green across all zones, activating jamming equipment that would turn their location into an electronic dead zone, invisible to conventional tracking methods. Kitchen stocked with enough for a week. Bedrooms through there with clean clothes in the closet. Bathroom has everything you need. He gestured efficiently while pulling a burner phone from a concealed drawer, already planning the calls he'd need to make. Take a shower, eat something, try to decompress if you can. I need to contact people I trust, people who can start moving pieces while Covenant figures out their timeline went sideways. Sienna stood in the center of the living room, looking lost despite her tactical training, despite years of operating in hostile environments. The adrenaline that had carried her through the evening was visibly crashing, leaving behind the trembling aftermath of sustained terror finally allowed to surface. You're really doing this, protecting me, even though you helped target me for assassination? Dante's voice carried no accusation, just acknowledgement of fact that needed addressing directly. Yes, because you made a different choice when it mattered most. Because that choice probably saved my life tonight. And because, he paused, something shifting in his dark eyes. I understand what it means to be trapped in something you never meant to become, to wake up one day and realize the person in the mirror isn't who you thought you'd be. He crossed to her, close enough that she could see the fine lines around his eyes, evidence of years spent carrying weight others couldn't see or understand. You're safe here, Sienna. Whatever happens next, whatever we discover about who's hunting us and why, you're under my protection now. That means something specific in my world. It means no one touches you without going through me first. And going through me is considerably harder than Covenant's clients probably realize. The words settled over her like armor she hadn't known she needed, hadn't believed still existed in a world that had shown her only exploitation and betrayal. For 3 years, she'd navigated Covenant's world alone, trusting no one because trust was liability, keeping her daughter's existence compartmentalized away from everything else, because love was vulnerability that could be weaponized against her. Now a man she'd helped mark for death was offering her the one thing she'd stopped believing was real, genuine safety, freely given, without apparent strings attached. Thank you. The words came out broken, inadequate for what they needed to convey. I don't know how to. You don't need to know anything right now except that you're not alone anymore. Go. Shower. Rest if you can manage it. I'll be here when you're ready to start fighting back instead of just running. She nodded slowly, then moved toward the bathroom on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else. The door closed behind her, and moments later, the sound of water running provided cover for whatever tears she'd been holding back since walking into the obsidian room with nothing but desperate hope and borrowed courage. 3 hours later, Sienna emerged from the bedroom wearing borrowed clothes she'd found in the closet, generic but clean garments, the kind of untraceable clothing kept in safe houses for exactly these situations. Her hair was still damp from the shower, her face scrubbed clean of the day's accumulated fear, and something in her posture had shifted from hunted prey to simply exhausted survivor. Dante sat at the kitchen table surrounded by the debris of late-night intelligence gathering, laptop screens showing satellite imagery of Chicago neighborhoods, printed photographs spread like tarot cards across the surface, handwritten notes in shorthand only he could read. He'd removed his jacket, rolled his sleeves to the elbows, revealing forearms that told their own history in faded scars and the edge of a tattoo that disappeared beneath pushed-up fabric. "Coffee's fresh." He nodded toward the counter without looking up from whatever analysis consumed his attention. "You should eat something too. Protein bars in the upper cabinet, nothing gourmet, but they'll keep your blood sugar stable while we figure out next steps." Sienna poured coffee and retrieved a protein bar, settling into the chair across from him with the careful movements of someone still expecting the world to collapse without warning. "What have you found?" "Questions, mostly. Answers are proving harder to extract." He pushed a photograph toward her, a corporate headshot of a silver-haired man, with the kind of smile that looked practiced for shareholder meetings and charity galas. "Recognize him?" She studied the image with pattern recognition, engaging despite her exhaustion, analyzing features and context with trained precision. "No. Should I?" Marcus Thorne, CEO of Meridian Development Partners, one of Chicago's most respected commercial real estate firms. "We've been competing for the same lakefront property for 6 months, a development deal worth approximately $400 million when fully realized. Last week, the city council signaled they're leaning toward my proposal over his." Dante leaned back, coffee cup cradled in hands that had done things she probably didn't want to imagine. 3 days after that signal, Covenant receives a contract on my life. Coincidence doesn't stretch that far. The connection seemed obvious, but Sienna's training made her cautious about conclusions that presented themselves too readily. Correlation isn't causation, even when the timing seems damning. A $400 million deal is significant money, but hiring Covenant costs serious resources and carries serious risk of exposure. Would a legitimate real estate developer really escalate to assassination over a property bid? The risk-reward calculation doesn't make sense. Normally, no. A rational businessman would accept the loss and move on to the next opportunity. Dante's eyes met hers, and she saw something there she hadn't expected, not anger or cold calculation, but a deep weariness that suggested this story had roots extending far beyond recent business competition. "But Marcus Thorne and I have history that predates any development deal, history that makes rationality irrelevant." He stood, moving to the window where dawn was beginning to paint the Indiana sky in shades of gray and gold, the first light of a new day breaking over a landscape that looked nothing like the danger they'd fled. His silhouette against the emerging light looked suddenly older, carrying weight that had nothing to do with the current crisis. 23 years ago, I was a kid running packages for whoever paid enough to keep me fed. My mother had died the year before overdose, though the official report said heart failure because someone paid to keep the embarrassment quiet and the investigation closed. I was 16 years old, angry at everything, and convinced that the world owed me violence for what it had taken from me. Sienna listened without interrupting, understanding that this confession served purposes beyond simple information sharing. He was explaining why he'd chosen to protect her, why her situation resonated with something deep enough to override pragmatic self-interest that should have seen her as liability rather than opportunity. Marcus Thorne was a junior executive at his father's company back then, learning the business while enjoying the privileges that came with family wealth. He had a habit of cruising certain neighborhoods late at night, looking for entertainment that his social circle couldn't provide. Dante's voice flattened into something that could be safely handled, emotion compressed into recitation. "One night, he picked up a girl I knew from the streets, 13 years old, though she looked older because hunger ages children faster than years ever could. Her name was Marisol. The name hung in the air with the weight of someone no longer alive to speak it themselves, a ghost summoned by syllables that still carried power after more than 2 decades. She disappeared for 3 inner days. When she came back, she wasn't Marisol anymore. Whatever happened in those 3 days, it broke something fundamental inside her that couldn't be repaired. She stopped talking to anyone, stopped eating unless forced, stopped being present in any meaningful way even when she was physically standing right in front of you. His knuckles whitened against the windowsill, tension visible in every line of his body. 6 weeks later, she walked into Lake Michigan and didn't walk out. They found her body 3 days after that, washed up on a beach where tourists would find her. Sienna felt the horror of it settling into her bones, not just the tragedy itself, but the recognition that this man had carried it for over 2 decades, had built an entire empire with this wound at its foundation, bleeding silently beneath everything he'd constructed. I tried to go to the police with what I knew, what I'd pieced together from her silences and the rumors on the street. They laughed at me. A 16-year-old street kid accusing one of Chicago's golden sons of crimes nobody wanted to believe happened. I tried to talk to Thorne's father directly, and his security beat me badly enough that I spent a week recovering in a church basement because hospitals ask questions and file reports. Dante turned from the window, his face carved from something harder than stone, something that had been forging itself for 23 years in fires that never quite went out. I promised myself that day that I would become powerful enough that no one could ever dismiss me again, that I would find a way to make Marcus Thorne answer for what he did to Marisol, for what he stole from a girl who never got the chance to become whoever she might have been. And now he's trying to kill you first. Sienna understood the full shape of it now, not just business competition or criminal rivalry, but decades of circling each other, predator and prey, uncertain which role belonged to whom. He knows you haven't forgotten. He knows that eventually, with enough power and enough patience, you'll come for him. The development deal isn't really about money or property. It's about legitimacy, about access. Dante returned to the table, sitting heavily like the weight of memory had exhausted him. That lakefront property would establish me as a major player in Chicago's legitimate business community. It would give me access to social circles where Thorne has hidden for 20 years, protected by wealth and reputation and the willingness of polite society to ignore what happens in shadows. He's not trying to win a business competition. He's trying to eliminate a threat he's been watching grow since I was a broken teenager, swearing vengeance over a dead girl nobody else remembers or cares about. Morning brought reinforcements. Dante's inner circle arrived at intervals calculated to avoid pattern recognition, a precaution that revealed how seriously he took Covenant's surveillance capabilities. Each arrival underwent verification protocols that would have seemed paranoid to civilians, but registered as basic operational security to Sienna's trained eye. First came Yuki Tanabe, a woman in her 50s whose silver-streaked hair and reading glasses disguised one of the most dangerous intelligence operatives Dante employed. She'd spent 15 years with Japanese intelligence before certain disagreements about methods led to early retirement and eventual recruitment into Dante's organization, where her skills found more appreciative employment. The Meridian Tower sniper team extracted cleanly. Yuki spread surveillance photographs across the table, her voice carrying the clipped efficiency of someone who'd delivered difficult briefings to difficult people for decades. Local police received an anonymous tip about suspicious activity, but by the time they responded, the position was completely sanitized. Professional work, no shells, no prints, and no equipment left behind. Covenant doesn't make mistakes. Sienna studied the photographs, recognizing the deliberate absence of evidence as signature methodology she'd seen documented many times. They'll have backup extraction protocols, alternative communication channels, contingency plans for exactly this scenario when primary operation is compromised. Yuki's gaze assessed her with the particular intensity of one professional evaluating another across a table where trust hadn't yet been established. You understand their protocols well. I helped write some of them. No point hiding what she'd been, these people would learn everything about her soon enough. And controlling the narrative was better than letting suspicion fester into something worse. 3 years providing target analysis, vulnerability assessments, operational timing. I know how they think because I was part of the thinking. The second arrival was Tobias Crane, a massive man whose gentle demeanor contradicted his physical presence entirely. He handled Dante's legitimate business operations, the real estate developments, the charitable foundations, the political relationships that provided cover for everything that couldn't appear in official records. I've been tracing the money through every channel I can access. Tobias settled his considerable bulk into a chair that creaked protest. Covenant's payment structure runs through 17 shell companies across 4 jurisdictions, but the origination point. He pulled up a diagram on his laptop that looked like a conspiracy theorist's fever dream made real, arrows connecting boxes in patterns that spiraled toward a single source. Meridian Development Partners. Specifically, a subsidiary called Lakefront Holdings LLC that exists only on paper. Dante studied the diagram with intensity reserved for death sentences or perhaps for writing them. Can we prove it legally? Documentation that would hold up if we needed to take this through legitimate channels? Proving it legally would require subpoenas, international cooperation from jurisdictions that don't cooperate, and about 18 months of litigation, during which you'd probably be dead. Tobias's bluntness carried no judgment, just assessment of reality. Proving it to our satisfaction? Already done. Thorne funded this contract. The question isn't who, it's why now, and what's his endgame beyond just eliminating you. The third arrival answered that question with information that shifted everything. Petra Volkov handled the kind of intelligence gathering that required accessing systems no one was supposed to access, using methods no one was supposed to know existed. Thorne's been busy on multiple fronts. Petra's accent carried traces of Eastern European origins she'd never fully explained. Beyond the Covenant contract, he's been consolidating political support for the lakefront development. City council members receiving unusual campaign contributions. Zoning officials suddenly able to afford vacation properties they couldn't have dreamed of last year. A coordinated campaign to ensure that even if you survive the assassination, you lose the legitimate competition anyway. He's not just trying to kill me, Dante realized, the scope of it crystallizing into something almost admirable in its comprehensive ambition. He's trying to erase me completely, eliminate the physical threat while simultaneously destroying my business reputation and political connections. Even if the assassination fails, I lose the development deal, lose credibility, lose the legitimate foothold I've spent years building. He wins either way. It's actually elegant, in a sociopathic way. Sienna found herself grudgingly impressed by the strategic thinking, even as she recognized herself as collateral damage within it. Remove the competition permanently, acquire the property, and establish himself as Chicago's dominant developer for the next generation. By the time anyone connects dots that were never supposed to be visible, he's too powerful to touch. Yuki pulled up additional files, her expression suggesting worse news was incoming. There's more. Our sources within Chicago PD indicate that an anonymous tip is being prepared, detailed information about your criminal operations, evidence packages that would trigger federal investigation. Timeline suggests deployment within the week, coordinated with whatever fallback plan Covenant implements after last night's failure. The attack was comprehensive, multi-vector, designed to destroy Dante, whether through bullet or bureaucracy, or public exposure. Marcus Thorne had spent months, maybe years, preparing this offensive, and last night's warning had disrupted only the most visible component of a much larger machine. He's scared. Dante's voice carried certainty rather than question. You don't spend this kind of resources, take these kinds of risks, build this elaborate a plan unless you're genuinely afraid of what happens if you don't. Thorne knows I've been building toward something. He's trying to stop me before I'm ready to strike. Ready for what? Sienna asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Dante met her eyes with cold determination that had been forging itself for 23 years in fires that never went out. Ready to make him answer for Marisol. Ready to tear down everything he's built the same way he tore down a 13-year-old girl who never hurt anyone. Ready to show him that wealth and power don't protect you from consequences, they just delay them until someone patient enough comes along to collect. The whiteboard filled with Dante's strategic architecture over the next 2 hours, connections forming between targets and methods, like a spider spinning web across multiple anchor points. His team contributed expertise to each vector, refining approaches and identifying vulnerabilities that their combined decades of experience made visible. Covenant's weakness is their business model. Sienna found herself drawn into the planning despite exhaustion that should have sent her to bed hours ago. They survive on reputation. Clients pay premium prices because Covenant guarantees results and absolute discretion. If either of those pillars cracks, their entire operation becomes vulnerable to the kind of scrutiny they've avoided for years. She moved to the whiteboard, adding annotations to Dante's framework with handwriting that revealed her military background and its precision. The sniper team's failure last night is already a crack in the foundation. I didn't check in when scheduled. The timeline broke completely, and their target received warning from their own asset. Somewhere in Covenant's hierarchy right now, Uncomfortable questions are being asked about operational security. How do we widen that crack into something they can't repair? Yuki leaned forward with predatory interest. We make them visible to people they've hidden from for years. Covenant operates exclusively in shadows. Their clients trust them specifically because exposure never happens, because evidence never surfaces, because investigations never gain traction. If we can document their operations, identify their personnel with names and faces, threaten to release that information publicly to law enforcement and media simultaneously, they'd have to choose between eliminating the threat or cutting losses and disappearing entirely. Dante completed her thought, seeing the full shape of the strategy. Either response works for our purposes. If they come after us harder, they expose themselves further trying to contain the leak. If they retreat to protect their organization, Thorn loses his most dangerous weapon precisely when he needs it most. Tobias raised practical concerns that needed addressing. Documentation requires evidence we don't currently possess. Covenant's operational security is legendary precisely because they don't leave traces, no paper trails, no digital footprints, no witnesses who survive long enough to testify. They left one trace they didn't anticipate. Sienna tapped her own chest with a finger that had stopped trembling hours ago. Me. I know faces, protocols, communication methods, safe house locations across 3 cities. 3 years of institutional knowledge that I was never supposed to share with anyone outside the organization, knowledge I memorized because good analysts remember everything. Combined with whatever surveillance your people can gather over the next few days, we can build a profile threatening enough to force their hand. The risk inherent in her proposal was obvious to everyone in the room. Positioning Sienna as the source of Covenant's exposure would paint an even larger target on her back, making her more valuable to eliminate than even Dante himself. No. Dante's voice carried finality that ended discussion. We're not using you as bait. I didn't pull you out of one kill box just to put you in another. There has to be a different approach. There isn't one that works as fast as we need. She met his objection with calm that surprised her, the acceptance of someone who'd already made peace with mathematics that didn't lie. I'm already their target, that reality doesn't change whether I help you or hide in a basement. The cleanup team at my apartment wasn't theoretical threat. They were preparing to make me disappear before I could become liability. She stepped closer, needing him to understand what she was really offering. My daughter needs someone powerful enough to protect her if something happens to me. Someone Covenant can't buy or intimidate or eliminate. I'm not being noble, Dante. I'm being strategic. Emma's safety matters more than mine. Dante stared at her for a long moment, calculating probabilities and costs with intensity he usually reserved for decisions worth millions. Then something shifted in his expression, not agreement, but recognition of her determination, and perhaps respect for the sacrifice it represented. You're right that we need leverage against Covenant, but you're wrong about the cost we have to pay for it. He turned to Petra. You said you accessed Thorn's communications. Can you do the same with Covenant's infrastructure? Their security is considerably more sophisticated than corporate systems, but Petra's fingers were already moving across her tablet, running calculations. Given what Sienna knows about their protocols, encryption standards, communication schedules, server locations, I might be able to find entry points I'd otherwise miss entirely. It would take time. Days. Maybe a week. But theoretically possible. Then we buy that time through misdirection. Dante began modifying the whiteboard, strategy shifting from defensive posture to aggressive manipulation of enemy expectations. We make Thorn think his plan is working exactly as designed. We go dark, make it look like we're scrambling, that the assassination attempt has us running scared and desperate. Meanwhile, Petra works on accessing Covenant systems. Yuki builds comprehensive evidence package against Thorn's legitimate operations, and Tobias prepares financial counterattack that will cripple his business when we're ready to deploy it. And me? Sienna asked. You stay alive. You stay hidden. You help us understand exactly how Covenant will respond to each move we make, how they'll interpret our actions, where they'll look for us. He gripped her shoulder firmly, the contact grounding rather than threatening. Your knowledge is valuable beyond measure, but you're more than intelligence asset to be spent. You're under my protection, and that means I don't trade your life like currency, no matter how favorable the exchange rate might seem. The counteroffensive launched 5 days later with surgical precision across multiple fronts simultaneously, each element timed to maximize confusion and minimize opportunity for coordinated response. The first blow landed at 6 a.m. when federal agents tipped by anonymous sources with impeccable documentation that couldn't be traced back to its actual origins raided Lakefront Holdings LLC's registered offices in downtown Chicago. The evidence package Yuki had assembled proved that Thorne's subsidiary had been laundering money through the development deal, using shell companies to hide funds that traced back to operations no legitimate businessman should have been anywhere near. The raid itself wouldn't result in criminal charges against Thorne personally. His lawyers were too good, his insulation too thorough, his paper trail too carefully obscured. But the public spectacle of federal agents carrying boxes from offices connected to Chicago's most prestigious developer achieved something more valuable than prosecution. It destroyed the legitimacy he'd spent decades cultivating, reputation, collateral damage that couldn't be undone. News coverage is exactly what we projected. Tobias monitored multiple screens showing local and national media breathlessly reporting on the scandal, anchors speculating about what the investigation might reveal. Thorne's trying to distance himself, claiming he had no knowledge of the subsidiary's activities, but the association is already poisoning his political relationships. Council members who supported him last week are suddenly unavailable for comment. The second blow landed 3 hours later when Petra's infiltration of Covenant's communication systems finally bore fruit worth harvesting. She'd identified the handler coordinating the contract against Dante, a man named Victor Strand, who operated from supposedly secure location in Milwaukee, confident in anonymity that had just evaporated. More importantly, she'd found records of Covenant's client communications, including encrypted messages between Strand and Thorne's personal attorney discussing payment, schedules, and operational updates in language that left no room for innocent interpretation. "We have everything we need to end this." Petra's satisfaction was evident despite her professional composure. Enough documentation to prove Thorne directly contracted the assassination attempt, enough to expose Covenant's operational structure to every law enforcement agency that's been hunting them unsuccessfully for years. The information was distributed simultaneously to FBI field offices, Interpol coordination centers, and 3 major news organizations known for aggressive investigative journalism that didn't wait for official confirmation. Within hours, Covenant's carefully maintained invisibility shattered into 1,000 pieces. Names, faces, operational locations all suddenly visible to a world that had only whispered about their existence in rumors and speculation. Victor Strand was arrested attempting to flee Milwaukee by private aircraft. 3 other Covenant operatives were detained at international airports trying to leave the country on false documents. The organization that had seemed untouchable 48 hours earlier was suddenly hemorrhaging personnel and operational security, too busy managing crisis to pursue contracts. Thorne will know we're behind this. Yuki's assessment carried warning that needed acknowledgement. The federal raid timing, the Covenant exposure. He'll realize these are coordinated attacks, not coincidental investigations. He has resources we haven't neutralized yet. Personal security, remaining political connections, the desperation of a man watching everything he built collapse around him. I'm counting on his desperation. Dante checked his weapon with practiced efficiency. A ritual Sienna had watched him perform before each phase of the operation, preparation meeting readiness. Desperate men make mistakes they'd never make with clear heads. Thorne has spent 23 years hiding behind wealth and respectability like armor. When that armor fails, when the protection he's always relied on disappears, he'll reveal who he really is underneath, and then I'll know exactly where to find him. The confrontation came that evening, though not in the way any of them had predicted or planned for. Dante had returned to Chicago, making himself visible at the Obsidian Room where everything had begun 1 week earlier. The message was deliberate and unmistakable. He wasn't hiding, wasn't running scared, wasn't afraid of whatever Thorne might attempt with his remaining diminished resources. He was waiting, patient as he'd always been, for the moment when his enemy would come to him. Marcus Thorne arrived at 9 p.m., walking through the door with the rigid posture of a man whose world was collapsing, but whose pride absolutely refused to acknowledge defeat. His silver hair was immaculate as always. His suit probably cost more than most people's annual salary, but something in his eyes had cracked the composure of decades, finally failing under pressure he'd never anticipated facing. "You think you've won?" Thorne's voice carried across the quiet room, drawing glances from other patrons who recognized both men and understood they were witnessing something significant, something that would be discussed in whispers for years. "You think exposing my business arrangements and burning your own source inside Covenant somehow gives you victory over me?" Dante remained seated in the same strategic position he'd occupied the night Sienna first, approached him with warning and desperate hope. "I think you're standing in a room full of witnesses, making statements that could easily be interpreted as confession by anyone paying attention. I think your lawyers are probably screaming into voicemails you're deliberately ignoring. And I think you came here tonight because you finally realized that money and reputation were the only things protecting you from consequences you've been running from for 23 years. The name hung unspoken. Between them, ghost of a girl who'd never gotten justice, but Dante spoke it anyway. Marisol. Thorne's composure cracked further, rage bleeding through the carefully maintained facade he'd worn for decades. That was ancient history, a mistake from a different era, when I was young and stupid. I've spent decades since then building something that actually matters, contributing to this city, creating jobs and opportunities for thousands of people. You're going to destroy all of that over a girl nobody remembers? Nobody cares about except you? I remember everything about her." Dante stood slowly, the movement carrying threat without overt aggression, controlled violence waiting for permission to release. "Her name, her face, and the way she laughed before you broke her. I remember finding her body on the lakeshore because police didn't bother searching properly for a runaway nobody cared about. I remember promising myself that someday I'd be powerful enough to make you answer for what you did to her. So what now?" Thorne's voice turned desperate, the question of a man watching his options disappear one by one. "You kill me here? Add murder to whatever charges your enemies will eventually bring against you? Throw away everything you've built for revenge? I don't need to kill you to destroy you." Dante's smile carried something beyond danger satisfaction, perhaps, or the particular piece of someone finally completing a promise made decades ago to a dead girl. "The federal investigation will take months to work through your finances, uncovering things you thought were buried forever. The media exposure will ensure you're unhireable, uninvestable, and untouchable by the society you've spent your entire life trying to impress. And the evidence Petra found in Covenant's systems? The recordings of you discussing my assassination with Victor Strand in your own voice? Those go to the prosecutor tomorrow morning. Murder charges, conspiracy, charges, financial crimes, spanning decades layers of legal consequence that would pursue Marcus Thorne until his dying breath, stripping away everything he'd built, everything he valued, everything he'd tried to protect by eliminating Dante before this day could arrive. You'll spend the rest of your life in courtrooms and prison cells." Dante stepped closer, close enough that his words reached only Thorne's ears, intimate and terrible. "And every single day you'll know that this happened because a 16-year-old boy promised a dead girl that her story wouldn't end with her body on a beach. That's my victory, Thorne. Not your death, your complete destruction. Exactly what you did to Marisol, returned across 23 years of patient, methodical preparation." Thorne's face collapsed into something ugly fear and rage, and the recognition that escape was no longer possible through any door. He turned and walked out of the obsidian room without another word, his expensive suit and silver hair suddenly looking less like symbols of success and more like costume pieces from a performance that had finally, mercifully, ended. Dante watched him go, feeling something release in his chest that he'd carried so long it had become part of him, invisible weight he'd forgotten wasn't supposed to be there. The burden of promise, the patience of vengeance, the slow accumulation of power toward a single purpose, all of it suddenly lighter, suddenly manageable, suddenly complete. The weeks following Thorne's destruction brought changes that Sienna struggled to process with a mind still calibrated for constant threat. Covenant's organization was in shambles, their remaining operatives focused entirely on avoiding arrest rather than completing contracts that no longer mattered. Thorne himself was consumed by legal battles that would eventually result in multiple convictions, his political connections abandoning him with the speed that self-preservation always inspired. But transitioning from constant threat to relative safety proved more difficult than she'd anticipated. 3 years of hypervigilance didn't simply evaporate because the source of danger had been neutralized. Dante noticed. Because Dante noticed everything that mattered. You're not sleeping. His observation came over breakfast at a safe house she no longer needed but hadn't yet found courage to leave. The guest room lights come on around 2 a.m. every night. You pace until dawn, then pretend you rested when morning comes. I didn't realize you were monitoring my insomnia. I monitor everything that matters. No apology in the statement, just fact delivered with characteristic directness. You've spent years living in survival mode, body constantly preparing for threats that might materialize without warning. That doesn't simply stop because your mind knows the danger has passed. You need help transitioning professional help, if you'll accept it. The offer surprised her more than it should have. In Covenant's world, psychological weakness was liability to be hidden or exploited, never acknowledged as legitimate struggle deserving compassion. The idea that someone might recognize her trauma and offer assistance rather than leverage felt foreign enough to trigger suspicion before acceptance. Why do you care what happens to me now? You have what you needed. Covenants exposed, thorns finished, your vendetta is complete. I'm not useful anymore. Dante set down his coffee with deliberate precision. Do you remember what I told you that first night about the federal agent who saw something in me worth preserving even when I couldn't see it myself? That wasn't just philosophy I was sharing. She actually helped me quietly, unofficially, for years after I refused her deal, directed me toward legitimate opportunities when I was ready, warned me about threats from rivals who wanted to eliminate competition, because she believed someone who chose loyalty over safety, even dangerous loyalty, and had capacity for other choices if given the chance to make them. His eyes met hers with uncomfortable directness that demanded honesty in return. You walked into that restaurant and chose to save my life instead of collecting payment for my death. That tells me everything I need to know about who you're capable of becoming if someone gives you the chance I was given. Over the following weeks, he proved the offer wasn't empty words designed to secure her continued cooperation. A therapist appeared, someone who specialized in transitioning operatives from clandestine work to civilian existence, whose client list included former intelligence officers and reformed criminals seeking paths back to ordinary life. The sessions were brutal, requiring Sienna to confront reality of what she'd participated in, but redemptive in ways she hadn't expected or believed possible. New identity documents arrived with her photograph but different name. Sienna Voss ceased to exist legally, replaced by someone named Sarah Mitchell with clean history and no connections to Covenant or her former life. The transition was comprehensive. New social security number, new credit history, new employment records, showing legitimate security consulting work that could withstand any background check. You're giving me a completely fresh start. She studied the documents with analytical precision that couldn't fully shut off, recognizing quality work that would hold up under serious scrutiny. This must have cost a fortune to arrange. Irrelevant. Dante waved off the consideration entirely. What matters is whether you actually want it. The identity exists. The life is possible. But you have to choose to claim it rather than having it forced on you. 3 months later, Sarah Mitchell stood in a Minneapolis park watching a 6-year-old girl chase pigeons with fierce determination of someone who believed she might actually catch one. Emma's laughter carried across autumn, air like music she'd forgotten how to hear, melody she'd thought was lost forever. The reunion had been difficult, complicated by her ex-husband's understandable suspicion and Emma's confusion about a mother who'd been absent so long without adequate explanation. But Dante's resources had smoothed practical obstacles, legal arrangements, ensuring her parental rights, financial support that removed money as barrier, careful documentation establishing Sarah Mitchell as legitimate person with no dangerous connections that might follow her. She looks like you. Dante's voice came from beside her, his presence no longer startling after months of learning to recognize his approach. He'd appeared in Minneapolis periodically checking on her progress, ensuring the new identity held up under strain of actual daily use. The determination, especially, that's definitely inherited. She's angry with me still. Doesn't understand why I was gone, why I couldn't call more often, why everything's suddenly different now. Sarah watched Emma abandon the pigeons and sprint toward playground equipment with energy that seemed inexhaustible. Her therapist says it's normal developmental response. Children process feelings of abandonment through anger, before they can accept love again. And you? How are you processing everything? The question invited honesty she'd learned to offer him over months of unexpected trust. Some days are better than others. I still wake up scanning for threats that aren't there anymore. Still calculate exit routes automatically every time I enter unfamiliar building. But nightmares are less frequent now, and I'm starting to imagine a future that doesn't end in violence or running. She turned to face him fully, seeing again the complex man who'd chosen to protect her when pragmatism suggested otherwise. I never properly thanked you. Not just for the new identity or the resources or protection from Covenant, for believing I could be someone other than who they made me, for treating me like person worth saving rather than asset worth using. You saved my life. His response carried simple weight of undeniable fact. Everything else is just reciprocity. It's more than that, and you know it. She held his gaze, refusing to let him minimize what he'd done. You could have used my information and discarded me once threat was neutralized. That's what made strategic sense. Instead, you invested resources, took risks, built something that lets me be mother again. That's not reciprocity. That's grace. Dante was quiet for a long moment, watching Emma navigate playground equipment with fearless confidence of childhood unbroken by adult failures. When I was building toward Thorn, I told myself it was purely about justice, about making him pay for Marisol, balancing scales that had been wrong for decades. Part of that was true, I won't pretend otherwise. He paused, choosing words with unusual care that suggested vulnerability rarely revealed. But part of it was also about proving that I could be something other than what circumstances made me. That the boy who grew up surrounded by violence could use his power for something besides creating more violence. Protecting you, helping you reclaim your life, that was evidence to myself that I wasn't just monster who destroyed different monster. The confession revealed vulnerability she'd glimpsed before but never fully understood until this moment. Dante Cale, whose name made powerful people nervous, whose reputation suggested capacity for terrible things, had been fighting his own battle for redemption alongside all his other wars. You're not a monster. She reached for his hand, the contact feeling natural despite its novelty. Monsters don't worry about whether they're monsters. They just consume and destroy without question or conscience. You question everything, every action, every consequence, every choice you make. That's not monstrousness. That's conscience trying to survive in impossible circumstances. Christmas arrived with snow that transformed Minneapolis into greeting card version of itself, everything softened and made beautiful by white covering that hid the ordinary beneath something magical. Sarah had decorated her modest apartment for first time in years, a tree in the corner, lights in windows, accumulated effort of someone reclaiming traditions she'd let go during her Covenant years. Emma had finally begun softening toward her, anger giving way to cautious hope that felt more precious than anything Sarah had ever possessed. She'd started calling Sarah Mom again instead of pointed Sienna she'd used for first month after reunion. Small victories that felt enormous against backdrop of everything she'd almost lost. Dante arrived Christmas Eve carrying wrapped package that clearly contained stuffed animal from its shape. I brought something for Emma. Is it appropriate? I wasn't sure about gift protocols for children her age. The admission of uncertainty from someone who commanded criminal empires and orchestrated destruction of powerful enemies made her smile with genuine warmth. It's perfect. She'll love it. They sat together after Emma had gone to bed, surrounded by debris of wrapping paper and holiday meal, the comfortable silence of people who'd moved beyond needing constant conversation to feel connected. I received word about Thorn today. Dante's voice was soft, respecting the quiet peace they'd built. Conviction on conspiracy charges came through. Sentencing happens in March, but prosecutors are confident he'll spend rest of his life in federal prison. The financial judgments have already stripped his assets completely. How do you feel about it finally being over? Empty, mostly. His honesty surprised her with its rawness. I spent 23 years building toward that moment, imagining countless times how it would feel to finally see him face consequences. The reality is quieter than I expected, less satisfying. Because revenge doesn't heal wounds, it just transfers pain from one person to another. She understood this truth from her own experience. What actually heals is building something good to replace what was broken. Is that what this is? His gesture encompassed her apartment, Emma sleeping peacefully down the hall, the accumulated evidence of life being carefully reconstructed. Something good replacing what was broken? I think it might be. She met his eyes, seeing again the complexity that had drawn her from the beginning, danger and gentleness coexisting, power and conscience in constant negotiation. I think we're both building something new from wreckage of who we used to be. And I think maybe we're building it together. The acknowledgement shifted something fundamental between them, naming what had been growing unnamed for months. What began as desperate survival, her warning, his protection had evolved through months of mutual support into something neither had expected but both had felt approaching. I'm not good at this. Dante's admission carried weight of genuine concern. Relationships, connection, ordinary things people build lives around. My world doesn't leave much room for softness. Neither does mine. Sarah moved closer, reducing distance between them to something intimate. But maybe that's exactly why we understand each other. We both know what survival costs. We both know what it means to choose something different anyway. Their fingers intertwined, decision made through action rather than declaration. Spring arrived in Chicago with enthusiasm of city emerging from winter's grip. Sarah stood at window of Dante's legitimate office corner suite in downtown Tower, representing everything he'd built toward during years of patient accumulation. The lakefront property deal had closed 2 weeks earlier, his proposal ultimately successful after Thorne's disqualification removed competition. Emma played in reception area supervised by Yuki's granddaughter, while adults handled business that had become familiar to Sarah over months of growing integration into Dante's world. She'd found role using her skills without moral compromises Covenant had demanded. Security consulting, threat assessment protection rather than targeting, prevention rather than facilitation of violence. The Foundation's first grant cycle is complete. Tobias appeared with reports. 12 programs funded, all focused on transition support for veterans and at-risk youth. The Marisol initiative is officially operational. The Foundation had been her suggestion, transforming his need for vengeance into something constructive, honoring the girl whose death had shaped his life by helping others facing similar vulnerabilities. "How does it feel?" she asked when they were alone. "Seeing her name on something that helps people? Different than I expected. Like the story doesn't have to end with tragedy. Like something beautiful can grow from even worse grief." She joined him at window, their reflections overlapping in glass, two people whose paths should never have crossed, whose connection emerged from violence but evolved into something like home. "I never told you about that first night at Obsidian Room." Dante's voice carried weight of confession. "Before you said anything, I knew something significant was happening. Like universe was delivering something I'd been waiting for without knowing." I felt it too. Her admission matched his in significance. Terrified walking through that door, but with bizarre certainty, I was exactly where I was supposed to be. "Emma asked yesterday if you were going to be her new dad." Sarah smiled at memory. "Said you make good pancakes and always notice when she's sad." "What did you tell her?" "That some families are born and some are built. That people who choose to love us are sometimes more important than those obligated to." Dante was quiet, processing weight of integration she'd offered place in family broken and reconstructed, held together by choice rather than obligation. "I spent decades building power because I thought it was only thing keeping me safe." His voice carried rawness of truths finally spoken. "But you and Emma have shown me safety can come from connection too." She kissed him then, two wounded people choosing each other, building something new from wreckage of who they'd been. Below, Emma laughed at something Yuki's granddaughter said. The sound carried upward like music, like promise, like evidence that even lives built on violence could eventually create space for joy. Dante and Sarah descended together to collect Emma and drive home through Chicago's evening traffic. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, his world never fully quieted. But tonight, they were simply family, improbable, imperfect, and profoundly grateful. As they pulled away, Emma chattering happily from back seat, Sarah caught Dante's eye in rearview mirror. The look carried everything they'd survived and everything they were building. Sometimes bravest thing we can do is trust someone with our truth, even when it makes us vulnerable. Sometimes protection comes from last person we'd expect. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, people who see us at our worst help us become our best. Thank you for following this story. If you enjoyed it, let me know in comments where you're watching from. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Your support means everything. Until next time, remember, some monsters can only be defeated by someone brave enough to ask for help, and some protectors are waiting for someone courageous enough to trust them.